Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the second part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy and the direct sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is part 1. It is highly recommended that you play part 1 before going into part 2 for the main reason that you will not get the emotional connection that you would by simply watching the story so far. So if you're wondering whether or not you should play part 1 before jumping into Rebirth, it is highly recommended you do so, considering that the story in Rebirth will reference the events of part 1 many times throughout its campaign. When you fire up the game, one of the things that you instantly see is the art style, mainly because you were introduced with a cutscene that takes place directly after the events of part 1, and the art style as it was in part 1 carries over in part 2. Many of the elements have been recreated masterfully and beautifully across the board, whether you're looking at the Cosmo Canyon, Golden Saucer, the Greenlands, you go through it. It doesn't matter. Every aspect of the art style that was present in the original game has been remade beautifully and masterfully in this game, and therefore it is amazing. So while the art style here in Rebirth is fantastic, the graphical modes that the game features isn't in the best of shape. What I mean by this is the game does have two graphical modes. It has the graphics mode and the performance mode. Both modes are underwhelming in my opinion, and it's because the graphics mode themselves, while it renders a nice clear-cut image, especially on a big screen, they did not input motion blur for the camera. What this means is that the game will always look choppy because the camera moves a lot, and without motion blur, it looks very, very choppy. Whereas if you choose the performance mode, while you do get a solid 60 frames per second, the image quality is not the greatest. So if you're playing on a big screen TV, it does come off as a little blurry, and therefore it's not as great as it could be. However, you do get the locked 60 frames per second for the most part. For me, I played the game in performance mode as I prefer the frame rate, but either way, both graphical modes are disappointing, but none of which takes away from the beautiful art that is in Final Fantasy VII. As for the story itself, well, this is where things get very, very interesting, as if you've played part 1 and you know the events, you know that there's room for possible changes from the original game, and without spoiling anything, the story in this game is very, very good. There have been some changes here and there, but for the gist of it, the story is really good. I'm not going to say what was changed, what wasn't changed. You're going to have to play for yourself. But what pertains to the story, what makes it really good, in my opinion, is the voiceovers, the acting, everything about it in terms of how they tell the story is pretty damn good, other than the minor pacing issues. There are a few moments here and there throughout the game's story where the pacing does feel a little off, it feels a little slow, but aside from this, the story and the way they tell it is absolutely fantastic, as to be expected. This is a remake of one of the greatest Final Fantasy games ever made. When it comes to the in-game audio's on point, voice acting's on point, sound effects is on point, music is on point. The only thing I will say about it is while the musical score in Final Fantasy VII is good, I would say that it's not as good as Final Fantasy 16. Like, I think Final Fantasy 16 had a beautiful musical score. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's music, although really, really good and nostalgia for somebody like myself, it wasn't as good overall in comparison to what Final Fantasy 16 offered, but still good nonetheless. But let's get into the meat and potatoes, and that is the core gameplay. So we'll start off with the combat. The combat of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is intact from what it was in Final Fantasy VII Remake, but they did add some new features. One of the new features with combat is a parry system. In the original game, in the remake, there was no parry system, but in Rebirth, there is a parry system, and it is encouraged to parry often because when you parry, it actually mitigates all damage. So you can prevent taking damage, and it is very important for the tougher encounters, especially on the harder difficulties. Furthermore, they also added synergy abilities, where two characters can team up for an ability, and these abilities don't even require an ATB charge. It just requires two individual charges of a separate category to allow you to perform synergy skills. Now, the synergy abilities also provide buffs to your party. A buff could be increased stagger damage. A buff could be an extra ATB charge. Another buff could be towards extra damage. Things of that nature that can really help elevate the combat, and it just gives new abilities and things to do within the combat itself. But aside from this, the combat is as you would expect it to be from Remake. But that's not where the gameplay additions end. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is loaded, and I mean loaded with minigames. And I'm not just talking about the Golden Saucer. Throughout the open world, as you explore, there's many minigames. A minigame, for example, could be when you go for Queen's Blood. Queen's Blood is a brand new minigame that's added to the game. It is a card game that you play, and it's very, very addicting. I know many people who enjoy Queen's Blood. Myself, personally, it was my favorite minigame. And I'm hoping that Square Enix decides to make a mobile game because Queen's Blood is really good. But that's just one minigame. They added a whole bunch of other minigames as well. For example, in the open world, if you want to cash in your Moogle medals, you have to find the Mog Mushroom, go into the Mog Mushroom, and then complete a minigame that requires you to round up the Moogles in order to complete the minigame, in which case opens up the shop and shop options, which you cash in your Moogle medals to upgrade your characters. Another minigame could be with the Proto Relics, where a Proto Relic is one of the things that is tied to the open world objectives that you will be reporting to Chadley. One of the minigames for the Proto Relics is Fort Condor, where you have to complete multiple Fort Condor missions in order to get the Proto Relics. As I said, these Proto Relics are something that has to be reported to Chadley. Yes, Chadley does return from Final Fantasy VII Remake, and he will be the one that you'll be handing in your open world activities to. When you complete an open world objective, he's the one that gets in contact with you, and he's the one that has the list of objectives for you to do. And as we all know from playing Remake, Chadley has the best materia. So if you want to get the best materia, the best spells, the best summons, you're going to have to entertain Chadley and do those objectives in order to get some of the best stuff, because you complete that stuff, get the currency, use the currency on him to get him to develop the specific materia. A materia, for example, could be fire and ice materia, where you get 2 spells for the price of 1 materia, but you can only get it through Chadley. With Chadley's return, you also get the combat simulator. This returns from the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and like in Remake, there's multiple challenges, some of which are combat tutorials for the new characters, such as Red 13, Kate Sith, etc., as well as being able to complete challenges that give you more materia. So all of this comes back and is around Chadley. So when it comes to the open world objectives, Chadley's your guy that you're going to have to deal with. And furthermore, when it comes to the combat of these characters, what's nice is that every character plays differently. My favorite character was Yuffie. Yuffie was a perfect balance of ranged and melee, but you need to do these side objectives if you want the best goodies. And it is very important, but everything you do is a minigame. You want to get your chocobo for the area that you're in? Well, you got to do a chocobo stealth mission where you have to capture the chocobo and able to use it for that region. So the game, these are all mini games that are within the game that's not even tied to the Golden Saucer, which I haven't even touched on yet. So speaking of the Golden Saucer itself, I kept my footage minimum deliberately because what they've done with the Golden Saucer is phenomenal. It was my favorite area to play in the game, and it brought back a whole load of nostalgia feels. But more so, they also have their own minigames that some people are familiar with. Perhaps the boxing minigame where you had to box, the minigame where you were on your bike and you had to race through fighting enemies, that returns. The chocobo races, that also returns. So while you have your minigames throughout the open world, you also have the minigames within the Golden Saucer, and much like the original game, Golden Saucer has its own currency, so you're going to want to complete these stuff to get even more goodies and upgrades. So while the game has a boatload of minigames, what I loved about having so many minigames is that it prevented the gameplay loop from getting boring. The combat was the same and iterated upon from part 1, but you're talking a large game. It took me 62 hours to complete this game, rolling the credits and doing the brunt of the best side activities. And the mini games just kept the game fresh. There's always something new to do. So the gameplay loop never really got boring for me because of how much there was in terms of side activities and gameplay changes. That it just kept the gameplay fresh my entire time through. Moving on, we also have to talk about some of the other issues that I had with this game as pertaining to the problems. I already spoke earlier about the graphical modes being underwhelming for what it is. I also talked about how the story had a little bit of pacing issues here and there, but nothing too major. The one I will say that I didn't touch on, and it pertains to Chadley, is with the open world formula. The open world formula is very traditional open world. You have these towers that you have to go to. You activate the tower. It opens up where the other items are. Yes, you can find the items without the towers, but the towers do make it easier as they identify the location of what other open world activities you are looking to do. Unfortunately, in order to complete all the objectives for Chadley, you still have to do the towers. And although they're not overly complicated, it was probably the one area of the open world that was repetitive for me, was the constant, go to a tower, open the tower, tell me where the other stuff is, and go do that stuff. Aside from that, there was not really any major problems I had in my playthrough with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. This game is flawless for the most part, other than those 3 minor inconveniences. And that's really how I consider it. Inconveniences. None of these things ruined my experience of the game in any way, shape, or form, but it was an inconvenience nonetheless. I would say the most disappointing thing was the underwhelming graphical modes that they had, but given the size and scale of the game, it is what it is. If you want to wait for the eventual probable PC version, maybe they fix some of this. But for the PlayStation version, these modes are the way they are. Maybe a PS5 Pro would fix this as well. But it is what it is in that regard. With regards to one more thing that I do want to touch on is particularly to the game's bosses. It's no surprise that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has a lot of bosses, and they do. Some of these bosses are brand new bosses that we have never ever seen before. And some of these bosses are old nostalgia veterans that we remember seeing back in the day. I won't say which bosses have come back, but they have brought back a bunch of bosses, some of which will be in positions that you may be different from the original game, but they are present, and it is interesting to see what they brought and what they changed and things of that nature. But overall, I would say that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a near perfect sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is recommended that you play the remake before jumping into this one. I'd even take it a step further to say that it's even more important if you played Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, and even if you played the original game on PlayStation 1 back in the day. But overall, even if you haven't played Crisis Core, if you haven't played the original game, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a fantastic RPG through and through. You can play it but without playing Remake. I personally do not recommend it, mainly because you don't get the emotional attachment that you would if you played it. But overall, it's a fantastic RPG. In terms of player choice for the narrative, the only real player choice that you have to worry about is your relationship with your party, as that will affect who you can go take on a date with in the Golden Saucer. But aside from this, it's a linear narrative experience that has open worlds or open sections where you can do different things. The worlds themselves are all different. If I was to nitpick on one little thing, and this doesn't deter the game in any way, it's just a personal preference of mine, you could not play as Cid or Vincent in Rebirth. And that was like the most disappointing aspect for me personally. I don't hold it against the game because it's not a flaw of the game itself. It's just a personal preference because Vincent Valentine was my favorite character in the original game. So not being able to play him now is kind of a little crummy, but it is what it is. They got to save something for part 3. That being said, overall, I think Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a fantastic RPG, one that many people should give a chance to. It is a fantastic ride through and through. I'm giving Final Fantasy VII Rebirth a 9.5 out of 10. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.